Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our Voices for Change series. Today's topic of discussion is exploring the use of artificial intelligence in equitable hiring practices. The rapid rise of generative artificial intelligence and other AI-based automations have prompted a discussion around the effectiveness of these computer programs and how people can implement it. And so, in today's episode, we want to explore ways in which these technologies are being used to make hiring decisions. My name is Preet Kiran Sandhu. I'm the manager of employer and stakeholder relations at TRIAC and the host for this podcast. To share their insights on this very important topic, we have with us today Kim Benedict, CEO and co-founder of Talent Minded Incorporated, and Tim Morton, founder and CEO of Prompta AI. Welcome to the podcast, Kim and Tim. It's a pleasure to have you both on the podcast. And before we begin, I'd like you to introduce yourselves to our listeners. We can start off with you, Kim, and then move to you, Tim.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So my name is Kim Benedict, and as you mentioned, Preet, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Talent Minded. We are the first subscription-based full-service recruiting solutions company in Canada. So that means we provide outsourced recruiting solutions. We're very passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion as we service our customers. We also provide advisory and consulting work to organizations on how to best run their recruitment practice. And of course, included in that is also a deep dive on diversity and inclusion and hiring best practices. So very happy to be here today and share some insights that are hopefully valuable to your audience.
Hi, my name is Tim Morton. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the founder and president of Prompta AI. And just a little bit about a background of about me. I started actually leading change and supporting culture change within organizations. And I was in a situation where I found myself feeling like a hypocrite because I couldn't bring my whole self to work. I was in a place where I was asked to pretend I was a straight, a straight male with, no family. And as a leader, I get leaders to get out of their comfort zone and to lead authentically and to be real and really to live diversity, equity, and inclusion, and found that I couldn't do that. And that was a big part of launching Prompta AI. We wanted to use data and remove some of those barriers. And so I'm really excited today with this topic. And I think it's an opportunity for all of us to start to unlearn, to rethink our processes and ways of working, and start to remove some of those biases that happen within our cultures in a work setting.
Great. Wow. Thank you. I'm so excited to speak with you on this topic. So let's start by reviewing the latest developments in this area. On November 9th, 2023, Ontario's Minister of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development, David Bikini, announced that the provincial government plans to ban employers from asking for Canadian experience on job postings or application forms and introduce legislation around the use of artificial intelligence in hiring process. On March 21st, 2024, the Working for Workers for Act 2023 received royal assent, which includes helping workers make informed decisions in their career search by requiring employers to disclose salary ranges in job postings and if artificial intelligence is used during the hiring process. So with these policy changes being announced, we would like to dive deeper to understand if and how the use of AI help companies make equitable hiring decisions as it relates to immigrant talent. So let's look at the hiring process first. We know that there are several practices organizations can implement in the hiring process to tackle biases. Some examples may include blind screening in the application process, diversifying the hiring panel, and communicating their DEI practices to interviewees. And in addition, employers are also incorporating artificial intelligence in their hiring practices. So, from your perspective, can you help us first identify what an equitable hiring process looks like? So we'll start with we'll start with you, Kim, and then we can move to you, Tim.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, that's a big question just to kick things off, Preet. But I think, first off, like how would we describe an equitable process, right? So I think when I think about an equitable process, it's consistent, it's fair at every stage of the process. Because I think oftentimes we just think about maybe the top of the funnel in the hiring process, and we're not necessarily thinking about candidates and their journey all the way through at every stage, at every conversion point. And so that would be a consistent and fair process at every stage, regardless of a person's background, how they identify, their circumstances, et cetera. And so I think you've already mentioned one. Either blind screening, as an example, can definitely be a way of implementing or executing an equitable process. I think one of the an easy place to start for a lot of organizations is simply the job ad.
Okay.
Right. So when we think about the job ad, which is oftentimes the first impression when a candidate sees an opportunity, and there's lots of studies that show, as an example, just thinking about diversity and thinking about gender specifically, that men will apply to a job if they feel like they have 50% of the qualifications, whereas women will not apply unless they feel like they have 100% of the qualifications. And I run something called the Women in Tech Sales Boot Camp, which helps train women on tech sales and connects them with employers. And oftentimes these are women that are coming from one industry background outside of tech and trying to pivot. And so, how do their transferable skills relate? And so I see this every day through that work, that it is alive and well, that women will not apply to a position, even if they feel like they're only missing one qualification. So a lot of these job ads that you still see employers using laundry list of qualifications, some of them maybe not even relevant to the role, and that can really deter not just women, but individuals with maybe international experience, not necessarily from a Canadian university or that Canadian experience that you were talking about. And I just find it very strange that in today's world of AI, with tools like ChatGPT as an example, that we are not seeing more inclusive language in our job ads. It's very easy to put your job ad into ChatGPT, ask for the prompt that it, creates something more inclusive, right? Where are the gaps around inclusivity and accommodations and things of that nature. So I think, at the very least, for organizations, when you're thinking about a more equitable process, look at your job ads first and foremost. Because we know that not only do women not apply, but we know that a lot of times the laundry list of qualifications, are what is limiting your access to some of these equity deserving groups.
Okay. That's great.
That's the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, that's just one out of 12 steps within a hiring process that I'm sure could be improved.
No, but that's such an important first step, right? Because that's where it's kind of making or breaking it for so many other immigrant applicants to know if they can get past that. And also the ATS systems, which we'll get to in the discussion. But Tim, what do you have to say about this? What is
I think Kim's spot on there. And even when we think about the job posting and the outreach, we really need to think about where we're advertising.
Okay.
And if we're really serious about having newcomers as part of our workforce and giving an understanding, we've got to cast that really diverse net, and we've got to make sure that we're we're finding the candidates. So figuring out where we're going to advertise. And I think another real key thing is being clear on what are the most important things about the job. What are the qualifications, not just the nice to have skills as well. The other thing is as we think about the end-to-end process and removing some of the existing biases, it's really important that we involve leadership. And one of the things that's so important as well is tying this to the mandate and the commitment and the vision for DEI within the organization. Tying it to ESG within your organization. Also, when we think about changing process and changing ways of working here, we need to think about it as transformational culture change. We're trying to change something within our culture, and we're trying to change it thinking about newcomers and having them top of mind. So part of this will be, and as we think about AI, part of this is adopting new ways of working, adopting practices that will minimize bias. We want to make sure that we're providing those opportunities, equal opportunities, regardless of, background and nationality and immigration status. And one of the things that, we've seen is right now people think that, or certain people think AI is the magic bullet. It's going to solve all of our bias issues, and it'll make an equitable process. But part of that is AI is an enabler. It's a tool. And it can enhance at different points, but we still as an organization need to change mindsets and beliefs and behaviors. And I think that's really important, because it's not in AI we trust. AI is not going to save us, but we can integrate AI within the process and make it a more equitable process. So if we really think about ways of working, we think about culture, and then start to incorporate AI into each step where it makes sense. But we can't do that in isolation. And there's lots of things that we can put in place. So for example, we could think about leveraging AI for skills assessment and simulations where it makes sense. We can look at structured video interviews where we could even have AI interviewing each one of the candidates. And there's things that we can put in place all the way through. But a big part of it is looking at our end-to-end process, understanding where it makes sense to put AI in, but also making sure that the people that are involved in the process all the way through are part of that process and supporting and guiding it as well.
Thank you. That helps me get this, bird's eye view or larger perspective of it's a process, people and tools kind of conversation, and then we are going to use a tool where it will help the system overall with the people involved, including both employers and immigrant job seekers. And that brings me to this how we are using it question now. And some of the things that you've rightly said right now is, modern applicant tracking systems powered by AI can help companies optimize their hiring decisions, like you said, by scanning resumes for key skills and qualifications, even to predictive analytics that can help identify potentially successful qualified candidates for a job role. So I understand that for employers, it can help them be more efficient, so to speak, in their hiring process. But for immigrant job seekers, this is a new area to navigate. And so we want to understand right now from both of you, how has AI influenced organizations' hiring practices in terms of promoting diversity and mitigating biases? I understand it's a strategy and also kind of what tools are being used right now. So in your experience, how is it being used to promote diversity and mitigate those biases? We'll start with you, Tim, and then we can move to you, Kim.
Perfect. So just a few things. So we talked about, widening the talent pool, and that's important. But also, I think when we think of even just from a candidate screening and selection perspective, AI can really help us to focus on skills and qualifications, and it can help to really promote more, equitable evaluation. So, we can put with AI, we can ignore names and addresses. We can ignore things that would be identified from somebody's background, their gender, some potential biases. We can also start to look as well as I'll give an example from our perspective. One of the things that we do a lot of change and transformation, and we know in different cultures around the world that change management is not a commonly used term in all parts of the world. Okay. But we can leverage AI to identify where somebody's actually doing change management without them actually saying change management. And that's a key thing where potentially in the past, that resume might get overlooked. But now, being able to use AI, we're actually able to say, oh, you know what, there's some relevant experience there. So I think that's one of those key opportunities that we're seeing. The other thing too is, as we talked about, the having AI conduct the interview, and this is starting to happen. So one of the interviews actually having AI with the candidate and AI with each one of the candidates separately, and being able to conduct that interview, provide a summary at the end of it, provide some incredible insights, and that is eliminating that bias. The thing, of course, about bias is we need to always be mindful of, was there bias in creating the AI? Who actually created the AI? But we can touch on that as well. One of the other things too is what AI is doing as well is it can actually help to evaluate. Whereas we might have a bias in how somebody is communicating in their non-native language, but AI is not that's not going to come through with AI. It's going to be able to provide a real clear understanding and a fair assessment when somebody's communicating their experiences. It's going to provide a real concise readout that highlights their skills and their experience as well. So the other thing where AI can help is really post support. When we're onboarding somebody and we're integrating them within the company, one of the big things that we see is that it's really important that we help from a cultural nuance perspective. If somebody's got skills and let's say they operated effectively doing this job somewhere else in the world, it's really important that we support them in the cultural nuances of our organization and of our working culture. And one of the ways that AI can help is providing an understanding of onboarding processes for newcomers within our organization, and it can provide some feedback, some sentiment feedback based on how have we integrated them effectively within our workplace. What support and mentoring have we provided? How effective has it been? And also help us to tailor custom training plans. So really understanding that that sentiment and what those experiences are, AI can help us with some real feedback as we move through. So those are just a few of the things that we're really starting to see.
Wow, that's helpful. That's really helpful to know. So you've taken us through the entire process. Okay. Kim.
I just want to add, yeah, I think what's interesting about everything that Tim said is like there's no limit to the opportunities, right? That AI has in transforming our HR practices. And I agree with everything that Tim mentioned. And I agree that AI, at the end of the day, will likely help organizations move to a more skills-based recruitment model, which will help to reduce bias in the process ultimately. But I do think like it's a bit of a slippery slope also, right? So, and I think, Tim, I've heard you say this, like AI is not the cure to bias. And further to your point earlier about developing a diverse talent pool and where you are promoting, AI won't move the dial on removing bias in the hiring process if the talent pool is not itself diverse. So I think to your point, where we're seeing AI show up in organizations like Current State, I think a lot of organizations are testing and piloting and experimenting with AI, and there's some low-hanging fruit that we've discussed here and Tim's touched on. I think we're looking for where AI can drive efficiencies, maybe take away, like automate some of those repetitive tasks. I think we're approaching this with caution, because I think when we get to decision making, I like the co-piloting example that you mentioned, Tim. So for example, we work with an organization, like one of the technologies in our tech stack for recruitment is a company, a platform called BrightHire. It does a lot of the things that Tim just mentioned. So it is involved in the interview. It's basically an AI interview co-piloting platform. So it will record your interview and it will take notes from the interview, from the candidate to the interviewee, the recruiter, the hiring manager, whoever that might be, and it will document those notes. And so what that allows you to do is it actually reduces bias in the interpretation of the candidate's answers. And we can also watch the interview back on, back to the hiring manager. So they're not just reading notes from a recruiter, they're actually getting like the entire viewpoint of the candidate and how they answered a question, as an example. The platform also helps to create interview guides that are consistent, right, and aligned to best practices in hiring, can create scoring matrices, because I think that consistency is one of the ways that it's a best practice for organizations in building inclusive hiring practices. The other way I think it's really important, and again, I think an easy step into leveraging AI in equitable hiring processes is using the data to make informed decisions about maybe where there are gaps. So Tim touched on this, and one of the organizations that we work with, as an example, they did a full data analysis on all of the hires that they have made over a period of time in their sales functions. And what they found, and tied that to performance, like that onboarding, time to productivity, performance. And they found no correlation between levels of education and whether or not a candidate was successful in the job. And so what that AI, leveraging AI and that data analysis determined that they actually removed educational requirements from the job ads. And so that has been increased the diversity of the talent pool at the top of the funnel, but more importantly, is giving them access to a more diverse talent pool. And so that is a way in which organizations can be leveraging, I think in a very safe way, into leveraging and then therefore improving the overall diversity of their recruiting practices, is by using the data to make better decisions, understand where your bias might exist or your blind spots and your gaps So that's just one example, like in practice, how organizations are leveraging AI to promote better diversity.
That's so interesting because that is what you mentioned earlier, right? The skills-based hiring base that if you eliminate and if you're solely dependent on the skills of the job candidate for that. I know you folks highlighted the different stages of where AI has been being used. In your experience, with what we know so far about AI and its usage in hiring practices, where do you think it where do you feel it works well and where does it fail or can be better?
Yeah,
Let's say
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I can kick this off. I mean, there's quite a few examples out there where there's been successes and there have been some failures and projects have been scrapped as a result. And I think that I think Tim, you alluded to this, and I think it's really important to mention here. AI isn't going to fix all of your processes, right? It's not going to fix all of your issues or your problems. There's some healthy optimism around the effects that it will have, and I truly believe that it will be positive. But we definitely need to, and I think most organizations are kind of approaching this with a lot of caution. And so we're seeing some experimentation, but I think some companies are also overwhelmed. And I think only 40% of organizations are actually leveraging or implementing some form of automation. Where we're seeing that it works well, and where I see the kind of immediate opportunity is in screening, right? AI can leverage data patterns, et cetera, millions of records compared to a recruiter who is manually screening every single resume. So I think just that repeatable, repetitive, very highly administrative, high volume tasks is where we're seeing most organizations leveraging AI tools. Chatbots, right, that help candidates match up their qualifications to which jobs might be available based on your location, your skill set, what you're looking for. So that's been very effective for organizations, reducing the overall time to the application time to schedule an interview, and overall providing a better candidate experience, right? And this certainly is simply not available at scale using or leveraging individual recruiters. So those sort of high volume, repeatable administrative tasks. I think where we've seen it fail is when there's sort of that bias that's implemented or integrated right into the system. As an example, like if you're looking at your current employee base and leveraging the data and the assessments from that talent pool that might not be as diverse, and then you're integrating that into sort of the rules of AI into your screening, and you're getting more of what you already have, that's where we're seeing these projects fail for organizations. And it certainly depends on the article that you read, but I did read an article that said 47% of job seekers believe that AI is better than humans at treating applicants fairly. So I think that's where a lot of organizations are seeing some success in kind of the early adoption of AI. And certainly, like I said, there's limitless possibilities, but that's where we're seeing the successes. And I think the failures come into play where we don't maybe have the skills of the individuals that are overseeing or implementing or integrating, because of course these are new skills that maybe a lot of us don't already have or haven't fully developed.
Okay.
Kim, I'm sure you've got lots to add to that.
Kim, I absolutely love the thinking about that overall candidate experience, which you talked about, and I just, even thinking about over the years, we'd hear people complain, "Hey, I went through 4 interviews or 5 interviews with this company, and I never heard back." And even just thinking about that, how that experience impacts your brand, and what somebody went through with that experience. I think it's I think it's one of those. You talked about automation, and I know that it's not because, not hearing back isn't because an HR person isn't working hard. They've got so many things that they're trying to manage on their plate and deal with. So I think both AI and automation, can help with that end-to-end experience. So, where AI is working well, I think some of the things here, you touched upon, but I think part of it too is for an organization, it can really enhance from a job matching perspective. So one of the things with AI is it can go through vast amounts of data, and really match candidates. If we've been able to cast that wide enough net, match candidates with opportunities based on the skills and the experience and the capabilities, and tie that to the company culture. One of the other things too, and we're not there yet from an AI perspective, but I know it's in the works, is we need to get to a place as well with newcomers where there's a real understanding based on AI of experience and school, the schooling that's been done in other countries, because of course, we all have our biases, and we all know, that's an outstanding university within Canada or the US or potentially England, but do we know that around the world? And that's one of the things that AI will get to, but we're not there yet. Coming, but
Yeah.
Some of the other areas that of course AI can fall short on is just potentially not understanding some of the cultural, the cultural nuances. So potentially, depending on the AI model that's being used, it may misinterpret a newcomer's resume or their capabilities. So it really depends on the AI that's being used and the biases that are currently within the AI. So it's really important thinking about who actually was involved in the development. Was it done from a lens of DEI, of inclusion? Was it done trying to make sure that we were incorporating talent from around the world? One of the other things, and Kim touched on it, is we risk that lack of personal touch.
Yes.
There's a fear right now and an apprehension about AI and our data and what we, for a lot of people, what we share, and it can feel overwhelming to a candidate. It can also feel overwhelming to employees within a culture if they haven't been prepared for the changes that are happening. But from a candidate perspective, it's really important too that we're transparent about how AI is being used. Yes. And if we're not, there can be an over-reliance on AI within the hiring process, which could put off some candidates, from going through the process. So we also need to, of course, think about privacy. We need to think about consent. We need to make sure it's ethical use of AI. So those are some key things that we've got to think through. And there's opportunities, but again, it's step-by-step transformation of our culture and our end-to-end process.
That's
you. Sorry to interrupt you, Preet, but you mentioned something there, Tim. Some of the recruitment. Well, excuse me. some of the recruitment, like global futurists, are predicting that actually having a one-to-one individual personal conversation with a recruiter is actually going to be a luxury
Wow.
and not the norm.
Yeah.
Because of the use of AI in certain circumstances. And I think, and we're far away from that, of course. But actually, I interviewed a young woman not that long ago, just last week, and she was getting to the final stages of an interview process, a hiring process. And the next step was to write a cover letter of why you were interested in the position. And the hiring manager said, and we caution you not to use AI to write that cover letter, because we'll know, because we've already received 3 that look identical. So I actually think it's on both sides, right? So organizations are starting to struggle with candidates, job seekers using AI to apply to 1,000 jobs on their behalf. So that's like really creating bottleneck and kind of chaos for some of the organizations who are now having to manage through that. What's a real candidate and what isn't? What's a real job seeker and what isn't? Right. So I think that there's like pros and cons and challenges on both sides. And one thing I just wanted to add, I think what would be really interesting, we're so focused, I think, on pacing, how do we remove bias, reduce bias, and using AI and other tools like that as an example. But I think one of the key first step, because I think turning to technology in order to, as a quick fix, right, to some of these like deep societal issues is problematic. So I think what would be very interesting to see organizations, and maybe some of them are already doing this, is to first leverage AI to detect, in fact, where the problems are at every stage of the hiring process. And because to your point, Tim, like AI and tools and technology can interpret patterns and see things that humans aren't ever going to be able to see, right, to the sheer mass amount of data. So I think that would be a really interesting flip side, because I think we're chasing this like a little bit of a holy grail on like how do we use this to reduce the AI, as opposed to really understanding where does it currently exist, because I think we're looking at the technology to fix a lot of our problems, and that's not necessarily going to have the outcomes that we're looking for.
And Kim, you're so spot on. And it's really combining that AI and human judgment. And I think part of this too is we can't lose sight of the importance of providing some of those foundations within organizations as well. So really thinking about making sure that there's effective training around diversity, equity, inclusion, and bias, and that understanding that we all do have bias. It's just, what are we going to do about it? And one of the other things too is tying this potentially into a current state diversity, equity, and inclusion audit. So really looking at your organization, looking and seeing you've got values, we've got a strategy in place around diversity and inclusion, we've got ESG, but what is the lived experience? What's really happening within our culture as well? So understanding the sentiment, and AI can support understanding the sentiment of what is the lived experience, and what's the lived experience of newcomers? What's the lived experience of different equity-seeking groups? What's the lived experience of those that are neurodiverse within our organization? And part of that will help to inform some of our AI processes and where things are falling. That can be included, but I think you're so spot on that it's AI is the tool, the enabler, but we've got to make sure from a foundational perspective that we're putting things in place. We really understand what's happening within our organization as well, because part of this as well can be we're actually selling a culture through this process. And if we believe a culture is something, that we're selling. And if our culture is so off base, and somebody arrives that first day, a new job, and they see that the organizational culture is nothing like what we sold them throughout, that's a big miss as well. So I think there's so much we can do from foundational, but sometimes what we're seeing is companies just want to tick a box. Hey, we're using AI. Look at us. And it's like how, when, how transparent. What are we doing from a continuous learning and adoption perspective? And so just being mindful of limitations, and also an understanding of what our true current state is and what our future goals are.
Yes, and what I want to do now is just in my research for this podcast, I was speaking to a few of my immigrant friends, and I wanted to these words that you said right now, consent and ethical use of AI, they are so important, because what's happening, or what I'm hearing, is a sudden shift in a lot of business owners using AI, right? And we are not equipped. Immigrant job seekers are not equipped to know what's in store for them, right, at the interview process. So this person who I know is my friend, who is a job seeker, she went in for an interview. There was another interview screen on the call, and the hiring manager, who's also the business owner, said, I have this software that I'm using right now to record you. And is that okay? So of course, goes without saying that she had to kind of agree, because she wants the job, right? So the software was basically recording everything that she was saying, like you said, the speech detector, maybe to help this person understand what their skills and qualifications are. And also this, if she's lying or not, basically. So it would read facial expressions and try to understand her personality match to the job, which was slightly, I don't know, it's just such a tricky space to navigate, right? And as an immigrant job seeker, you don't know what to kind of expect. So that's my only concern, is that where do you know what is right? Where do you know what to say? If it is yes or no kind of a thing, like how do you agree to the use of this technology when you are a job seeker, right? Because you have to kind of buy into this process. So there really is not so much choice. So you have to prepare yourself to be able to get past these technologies and the hiring manager. I don't know what you have to say for this, but this is something that I just really wanted to point out. It's a tricky situation. I'll move on to the next question, which is again about misinterpretation. Tim, you pointed out that word. And so in our research, we came across a study conducted by an immigrant professional placement firm called Upwardly Global. The study involves running resumes of immigrant and refugee job applicants through an AI-powered resume reading tool designed to assess skills and guide applicants through the job market, comparing skills against labor market data. What they found was that AI career guidance tool improperly recognized education 35% of the time and work experience 20% of the time. So therefore, recommendations such as upskilling, training programs, and job opportunities were incorrect. So my concern is around translating immigrant international experience and education. What knowledge needs to be built into AI tech to support better assessment of immigrant talent? I mean, how can we get past those biases related to non-Canadian experience, non-Canadian education? Do you think that that's achievable through the use of AI in hiring process?
Can I just jump in here? Because, my question to that, because I think that's really interesting, is what is the human percentage of misunderstanding of educational requirements, right? Versus what, compared to what we are currently doing? Because I think that is, whether you're using AI or not, the misinterpretation of those skills or the perceived value of those skills inherently, I think there's already a problem, tools or no tools. It would be very interesting, and I think it would be more difficult to actually extract the information, but it's to better understand versus what percentage of the human, like, is the human more accurate than what you were just suggesting? Because I think that is a very big problem to solve for, and there's no easy answer there.
Because that's where the real problem is, right? The challenge for immigrant job seekers is to know or to better express or to contextualize their international experience and education. So this is where I know we've spoken about this previously. Kim, you mentioned perceived risk. That's where it all lies. So I'm just trying to see from the immigrant job seeker lens, how can AI help solve this problem area, so to speak? I mean, I know it's a very tech heavy question, but Tim, do you have anything to say to this?
Yeah, you know what? It's what we're seeing right now is I haven't seen any AI yet that's there with regard to understanding the equivalent of schooling everywhere in the world. So I have not seen that. I know that there's work underway. I know there's work underway with it, but if I think about, if I really think about AI and the models, AI systems are only as unbiased as the data we use to train them. So it's really, it's really important that we think about what we're feeding into machine learning, and thinking about how we're using natural language processing, and even starting to look at some of our historical. So starting to look at some of our historical and where we've been, and just so we don't replicate those biases. So looking, what are the, how are we auditing what we're using? How are we making sure that we're updating those algorithms and correcting some of the mistakes and the biases that we're seeing? And I think that's one of the, the really big challenges. And I think, as Kim said, just both understanding, where we had those statistics around, here's where the AI is falling short, these percentages, also understanding, here's where we were falling short from a manual or a human perspective. And then how do we start to improve, how do we start to improve our results? How do we improve the algorithms? How do we train our AI, and make sure there's that lens to make sure that we're looking at newcomers, that we're looking at refugees, that we're that certain things aren't being discounted, and that we're not undervaluating some of the skills and the experience that newcomers are bringing. And I think that's so important. And one of the risks, of course, right now, as we've talked about, is that over-reliance on AI. It's really important. It's that whole thought too, garbage in, garbage out. How are we training our models? How are we making sure that the AI that we're using is actually going to get us the results that we need, and the candidates that we need, and making sure that the process is transparent, and that we're being accountable. And I just think that's such an important element here.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think too is we need to think about, it's not a one and done. We don't implement an AI system, and we need to monitor it. We need to, it's that monitoring, we need to watch our model, make sure it's learning, do some postmortems on what did happen, what's happening, and I think that's so important. And it goes to that balance again of the strengths of AI with human judgment and human oversight, and looking at this as, not one and done, but continuous improvement.
Wow. I think that's like the most important, right, element at this stage, certainly in the process, is there has to be those checks and balances, and I think, where, to your earlier question, Preet, about where there's failure, is generally that learning algorithm, right? And it's learning the bias and then doubling down on that bias as an example. And so I think I think there's going to be, there's not any perfect answers, but I definitely, it's coming regardless. And I mean, the example that you gave of your friend is an example of just how quickly it's coming and how pervasive it could potentially be. And we're not ready for it on both sides, right? Because one could argue that that there was a misstep there in that process because accommodations weren't made. We weren't informed of and to set proper expectations. The job seeker had no time to better understand how that tool that was being used in the process is built. What was it based on? I think, Tim, you mentioned like the algorithmic bias, right, is the primary concern, and in your friend who was in that interview at the time, and then of course you feel like you're discounting yourself from the process if you don't agree to what's happening. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of issues. But what I think it does indicate is it just shows how rapid this is coming, and how potentially powerful and harmful it can be all at the same time. And I think that's what organizations are really going to grapple with. And so that human oversight and that expertise combined with the power of AI, right? And then implement and making sure it's implemented fairly and ethically, and you're testing and checking, continuously monitoring, is what is going to make the difference. And I think it'll be where companies are successful if they make those level of investments. But one of my concerns is, do we even have the skills necessarily in HR to even know half of what we're talking about when we're thinking about or evaluating AI, right? I think how are we developing those skills internally within our own teams at the pace to keep up? That's definitely a question that I have. And I think what makes this kind of overwhelming for organizations, but at the same time, you can't ignore it, right? It's coming. So you have to do something. You have to get in and start working with it on some level.
Yes.
And I think if we can involve, HR people in the process as well, just thinking about if we're rolling out a tool and we haven't actually asked those people that are going to have to use the tool internally how this is going to impact them, or get their feedback, or get their buy-in, or get their alignment into it. It could be, hey, we've made the decision to start utilizing this as part of our process. But providing some understanding about what it is, what it's not, what's going to happen, what their role still is. I think that's so important. And Kim, you touched on it so well around that understanding of we need to be thinking about being transparent. So if somebody's going to if somebody's even going to respond to an initial posting, it would be really helpful and maybe ethical, and this may come into some of the regulatory thing, to let somebody know when they're applying that there will be some HR or some AI involvement. So, for example, with your friend who got surprised at the start of an interview, and the last thing any of us need when we prepared for an interview is a surprise. Oh, by the way, you're going to see that there's AI on this call as well. If you know that and you've prepared and you're mentally in it, okay, that's a different situation than showing up. We all do our homework before interviews. It's really important that from a transparency perspective that we're laying the groundwork and we're supporting people each step through the process. Because just even thinking about somebody who's part of the neurodiverse community,
Yes.
that we need to think about accommodation, and we really need to understand from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, how we're incorporating this through our end-to-end process.
Yes, and I think that the legislation is going to kind of force employers to, of course, disclose the use of AI, right? So that will make people think about what they're using, because they have to now publicly own what they're using in their process. I think we've covered one of the questions already in our conversation around solutions and strategies to consider more equitable use of AI in hiring newcomer talent. Just wanted to wrap up this discussion now around recommendations. What recommendations do you have for companies looking to improve their use of AI in hiring more equitably? And this goes for, I think, I also want to highlight, we have our, large scale employers as our listeners, but also a lot of small to medium-sized business owners, right? So in keeping that audience in mind, what recommendations would you have for these business owners and employers? We'll start with you, Tim.
Okay. So from my perspective, it's really important to involve all the way through. Involve your business, involve business users. Really think of this as business transformation and culture transformation, and we're moving from a current state to a future state. And as we're doing that, what education and training do we need? What do we need to put in place? What are those important things? It's really important that we start to think about transparency and accountability, and not lose sight of that. It's also important too that if with regard to AI, that there's an audit trail from an AI perspective. So if AI is helping to make decisions, it's really important that there's a trail, that we're looking to see if there is any bias that's incorporated within the AI, and if there is any unfair treatment that's happening. We also need to make sure that we're auditing what we're putting in, and we're mitigating any bias. We also need to think about our standards, and developments of standards, and make sure that we're when we're thinking about AI and hiring, that we're focused on fairness, we're focused on transparency, we're focused on privacy. We're thinking about no surprises through the process. We also need to make sure too, from a regulatory perspective, that we're keeping up from that oversight. So really understanding the legislation that's coming, understanding also, if you're operating within different jurisdictions, what different legislation and regulatory requirements are there. The other thing, for me, that's really important is not losing sight of the balance between human and AI, and that we're not dropping the ball anywhere. That there really is that. At the end of the day, when we think about this process, we want to make sure that it's fair and transparent, and it respects our values, and there's a diversity, equity, inclusion element, but also, we want to make sure too that it's not doing any damage to our brand.
Yes.
And that it's part of living our values corporately. So not looking at any of this in isolation, but end to end, but also the bigger picture.
Yes, so true. Wow.
Yeah, what I would add, because those are all really important points, and there's a couple of things that I think I would add, and in no order of importance at all. But one of the things that I keep thinking about is kind of the fact that when I think about recruitment specifically, and I think about the end-to-end recruiting process, because that's the world I live in every day, all day, is less than 20%, or sorry, less than 26% of companies are using modern tools
Okay.
today, right? So we oftentimes have very outdated, clunky applicant tracking systems. Preet, you mentioned our audience might be like small businesses as an example. Some of them are still using email
Yes.
for hiring, right? As an example. So I sometimes worry, like, we're not necessarily leveraging or using the most modern tools and technology that are available current state, that are proven, right? And maybe less risky, as an example. So I think about that as, Tim, we've talked a little bit about this, is really understanding your current state. Because I think if you're trying to jump in, head first, and you're not necessarily leveraging the tools and the technology that you currently have, like, is your organization really ready for that? And what is it exactly that you are trying to accomplish? So I think that it is really critical as a recommendation. And I know it's not the sexiest recommendation that, companies want to hear, but is really understanding, like, audit your current state, look at your end-to-end process. Everything that we were doing before is not going to be it's not going to be the future. It's not going to necessarily be relevant. But also, like, the tools and the technology that we're currently maybe not leveraging effectively, and how's that all going to fit in?
Mm.
So that's one. I'm kind of thinking about a recent. It was only in November, where we were working with an organization. There was a high volume of hiring that needed to happen. We were talking to the business, as you're saying, Tim, like involving the business in the process. We had the HR team, we had HR and the recruitment team all in the room. We're talking about the end-to-end recruitment process. There was a lot of hiring, so it needed to happen very quickly. And the business said, we get thousands of applications, and this is going to slow us down, right? Going through all of those applications. Why don't we just use AI, right, to get through that, within seconds, minutes? And the HR and recruitment team all of a sudden, had a gasp, right? Because all of a sudden we're implementing a new technology, a new process, right? And without really thinking about the consequences, how is this going to work, right? Like, there's implications. But it's I think it's just an important example. For me at that stage, it was like, what exactly are we trying to accomplish? Who is benefiting and who isn't benefiting in that scenario, as an example? Because the business wanted to get through something really quickly. The HR team wants to make sure that there's fairness, transparency, right? And so I think that that's really important. Again, maybe not the sexiest recommendation, but is really start, like, what are you trying to accomplish? Who's going to benefit and who possibly isn't going to benefit? And I think that's one of the key roles that HR is going to play as we look at implementing and integrating AI. The other thing is, I read a really interesting article that talked about the difference between recruitment teams that are using AI and experimenting and testing and trying new things versus those that haven't quite yet got to that point. And the perceptions of what the reality is. So the organizations that are not using AI, but they're thinking about it, and they're reading all the articles, and they're sitting on the sidelines kind of waiting, right? And they're thinking about, like, the wonderful outcomes and possibilities. Their reality of what AI is actually going to do for them and their organization and their hiring process is very different from the ones that are actually in there trying things current state. So I think there's this idea, right? There's this really big idea that, this is going to solve all of our problems from people, sitting on the sidelines versus the one. So my recommendation is like, get in there, because you're going to be super far behind if you have an idea of what this is going to do. And then you get in there and it doesn't exactly work the way that you want it to work. And the points of all of this conversation, there's so much more to think about. So my recommendation is kind of like, get in there and start doing something, because your perception of what is really possible or what the benefits are going to be might be different once you actually start tangibly working with different tools. And then I've seen some organizations like Assign an Owner. We're seeing organizations create AI committees when they're evaluating software. And they're bringing in different perspectives, right? Because we have a lot to think about. Like Tim mentioned, you've got privacy, security, you've got transparency. With new legislation, you may be forced to do those types of things. So I think that that's a really good best practice and a recommendations is to start think about building an AI committee internally to your organization. Anytime someone from the business is on the phone and says, "Hey, let's do this," right? You need a committee that has some viewpoints on this, and then assign an owner, assign an expertise, just like we assign a systems specialist within our organization. Think about maybe assigning somebody whose job or part of their job is to better understand and stay up on trends and to be that executive oversight or bring in the people that need to be. So I think that would be a recommendation, is find somebody in your organization who's savvy from a technology, maybe has a passion about this, and find ways to integrate them into these conversations, and possibly, looking at your processes and things of that nature, assign some ownership to it, because I think this can get away from organizations pretty quickly if there isn't some structure around how you're approaching this, and then maybe possibly creating some policies.
Yes.
And if I could just I think for a lot, it's where do I start? It's it's that overwhelmness of where do I start? And I think the importance is and Kim, you touched upon this. It's understanding the current state and also thinking about this as a journey. That we're not going to get there overnight, but it is important that we start to look at it, and it's important that we understand it. It's also important too that we involve those people through the journey, because if we really think about it, as human beings, we have a way of working and we love the current state. Even if we're open to technology and open to AI, as humans, we resist. But it's really important that we engage people along the way. We get them to move away from some of their tools. It's not helpful if we're thinking, oh, you know what, we've invested in these AI components, but then we find somebody who wasn't prepared to adopt, and they're still using their old Excel tools, and they're ignoring what we've put in place. It's really important that as we're making this investment, and as we're going step by step, that we involve people. And I think the other part of it too is getting feedback both internally, but also it's important to get feedback from those that are going through our process and our new process, including feedback from newcomers. And how did they feel about being part of an AI-driven hiring process? That can be so invaluable in providing areas for improvement.
Yes, of course, because with all that you mentioned, right, we can still hold those biases and implement it in the technology that we are using. So it can still be a continuous cycle of repeated mistakes, so to speak, and then reduce your talent pool for the employer, and have that as a problem area. But I still have my concerns, because I know that training around biases, training around understanding recruitment biases is still important with the use of technology, is what I'm understanding from what you both have spoken so far. Is we need to understand the role of technology for what it can do, but there is also the human element so involved in the strategy and the process of what we are trying to achieve through our recruitments. So it's a lot to think about, and I know there would be a lot to talk about also, because you're absolutely right, right? We don't know the evaluation piece of how it's affecting, and we don't know if there is research around it to know what it has worked or it's not worked, because um, like Kim said, when you are considering implementing a software, you need to understand if it's proven, if it's less risky. So these words, how do people use these words, and what is less risky or proven in terms of eliminating bias to do with newcomer hiring, all of these pieces. Wow. I have a lot to think about, but yeah, thank you so much for taking this time and for agreeing to do this, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. It's been a very enriching conversation to have, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot to take away. So thank you so very much, Tim and Kim, for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Preet and the team, for having us.
Great. So that concludes another episode of our Voices for Change series with Kim Benedict and Tim Morton, talking about the use of artificial intelligence in equitable hiring practices. To our audience, thank you for listening, and we hope you found the show insightful. If you enjoyed the podcast, do like, share, and comment about it, and remember to subscribe to our channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. The links are provided in the description below. We'll be back again with another episode in the Voices for Change series very soon, so stay tuned. For now, take care and goodbye.